Hello everyone, welcome back. In this video, I would like to bring to your attention a journal called James Baldwin Review. If you'd like to see what is going on in current Baldwin scholarship, this journal seems like an interesting place. And it is open access, so free of charge, even if you don't have institutional affiliation like myself. So that's a bonus. One paper in particular that I want to speak with you about, published there a few years ago, is about Baldwin's first novel. The paper is called Baptism by History, reading James Baldwin's Existential Hindsight in Go Tell It on the Mountain. The paper was written by Miller Wilborn, at the time graduate student at University of Texas at Austin. And this paper is really good, especially given that it was written by a grad student. And it addresses a very interesting question about the relationship between Baldwin and French existentialist thought as exemplified by Jean-Paul Sartre. Wilborn, does a few things in this paper. And any of these things, if you have interest in any of these three aspects of the paper, I would encourage you to go and check it out. First, Wilborn provides us with relevant biographical material about James Baldwin to do such a comparison. And those biographical materials do some of the work in justifying this project. Second, he provides us with a summary of Sartre, especially using the popular essay, Existentialism is a Humanism. I will speak more about that in a moment, about the limitations of having a simplified representation of Sartre, but a very in-depth representation of Baldwin. Okay, that asymmetry. And the last thing he does, he engages in a close reading of the novel Go Tell It on the Mountain. What is remarkable is the attention that Wilborn pays, the attention he gives to the development of the novel, the progress Baldwin made from early drafts to later and final draft. There was an evolution there. There was a development that reflects Baldwin's philosophy and how it helps us know how that is distinct, how it is similar to Sartre's existentialism. So let's go back, take a step back and think generally about this kind of study comparing two thinkers. Why do such a comparison in the first place? Comparative analysis of Sartre and Baldwin. Or you can think of comparison between Husserl and Charles Sanders Peirce, Heidegger and Kierkegaard. Is it just because we have two interests? I'm interested in this person and I'm interested in that person, and now I want to know how they compare, in what ways they are the same, in what ways they're different. I think that it is almost impossible when we are doing a comparison, it is almost impossible to be equally fair to both sides of the comparison, to go in depth equally to both sides. It is very difficult to escape having one primary interest and the other interest will be secondary. And that secondary interest actually is the means of understanding our primary interest. That's okay, as long as we are mindful of it, as long as we know that we are taking, in this case, we are taking Sartre's existentialism as a reference point, not even his entire body of thought, but a simplified summary of Sartre's existentialism, and using that as a point of reference, a new, fresh point of departure, as like a perspective we take on Baldwin, in order to understand Baldwin better. So the primary interest here is James Baldwin, and that's totally fine. But we have to know that. So we are not going to be equally fair to both thinkers. Okay, so that's almost very difficult to escape that. So I learned that from first time I was having a conversation with many years ago with a Husserl scholar, Edmund Husserl, the official founder of phenomenology. And this scholar of Husserl was interested, and he had a few papers published on Husserl's treatment of signs, semiology at work in Husserl. And then I just asked him, have you ever thought about Charles Sanders Peirce and his treatment of signs, his idea of how signs work? And his response was really, at the time, surprising to me. He said, I can't pay attention to two people and be fair to both people. I'm going to misread one of them if I do that. It's incredibly hard unless you have this superhuman sense of irony. You can detach completely from your first interest, one thinker, and then reattach to this other thinker. And he said, I'm just not going to do that because it's more practical and more fair to just stick with the person I'm studying, Husserl. And from within Husserl scholarship, the motivation to jump to Peirce is not, the motivation is not generated from within. It has to come from somewhere else. Anyways, going back to the paper at hand, just wanted to take that note about the difficulty of doing comparative analysis. It's very tricky, but you can make it more manageable by admitting that you have one primary interest. Okay, that's settled, I hope. There's historical reason for this interest in Baldwin and Sartre and the comparison between them. Because they were contemporaries, they were both participants in the Paris intellectual scene of the 1940s and 50s. And Wilborn tells us a very interesting, memorable story, the anecdote of when Baldwin arrives in Paris in November 1948. At that time, when Baldwin arrives in Paris, Sartre was at a cafe with three friends. They were having drinks, they were discussing. So Jean-Paul Sartre, three friends. One of those three friends stands up to go greet Baldwin upon his arrival in Paris. That one friend was Richard Wright, another important American writer, the author of The Native Son and many other works. Richard Wright served as Baldwin's mentor, friend, kind of sponsor figure, and very influential, especially in facilitating Baldwin's life in Paris. 2 years before, in 1946, 2 years before Baldwin's arrival, that famous essay by Sartre was published with the title Existentialism is a Humanism. In that essay, Sartre defends his notion of radical freedom, that human beings are condemned to be free, and the idea that we cannot escape into cultural resources, religion, pre-existing narratives, categories. Those places don't give us the meaning of our lives. We can engage with them, but the meaning ultimately comes from our own decisions, our own freedom, the exercise of our freedom. He does say, Sartre, that our personal freedoms are not detached from each other. So my personal freedom is not separable from your freedom. And as a consequence, I cannot want to be free without at the same time wanting for you to be free. The other point that Sartre makes that is important for our purpose is about discovering yourself and other people. The process of discovery involves and is simultaneous. Discovering oneself, self-discovery, is simultaneously a process of understanding other people. So here, Wilborn, after reviewing Sartre's essay, he writes, quote, "The concepts that will be most important for our purposes are the necessity of self-discovery facilitated by others, revelation of the other as the consequence of self-discovery." So, as a consequence of self-discovery, the other is revealed. And the ability of humans to create the future. Baldwin's approach, his view of the world, his artistic worldview, developed in his first novel in a much more explicitly historical way. It is much more explicitly grounded in history and the facts of history, the facts of biography, than Sartre's essay allows. In other words, with Baldwin, you can't be condemned to be free. You are not condemned to be free if you don't understand your history yet. If there are certain feelings, certain emotions that haven't become conscious yet, but they are operating subliminally. If those are left unexpressed, unrecognized, then the freedom isn't there. And this is relevant to the freedom to be yourself, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, that, sometimes people insist on those things without paying attention to training, the time it takes, the education it takes to be historically aware, culturally aware, aware of the society, the social conditions. Those kinds of consciousness are necessary for cultivation of self-expression. Let's read a little bit from the paper. Quote, in an outline for a novel, so that piece is called Outline for a Novel, contained in Baldwin's recently acquired papers, he writes that John's history includes generations and centuries of unfulfilled hatred, and elaborates that this hatred is so deep as to be almost wholly inarticulate and even unsuspected. Baldwin refers to the unresolved emotion present in the psyche of Black people that inevitably results from 400 years of their ancestors' enslavement. He explains that it runs so deep that it is nearly impossible to recognize. Because it has lived underground so long, this hatred has a special subtle and distorting power that pervades John's experience of reality, making the world ambiguous and full of terror for him. Since this force is so subtle and destructive at the same time, it constitutes a significant part of the barrier between John and his self-realization. He must face his history to overcome it. He must face his history to overcome it. And that is the difference between a simplified caricature reading of existentialist thought that we are condemned to be free, you can transcend, detach yourself from the conditions of your life, mind over whatever matter, material conditions. Your mind, just decide and you make it happen. No, it's not as simple. A little bit later in the paper, we read, quote, in his 1962 essay, The Creative Process, Baldwin articulates the problem more personally. Whoever cannot tell himself the truth about his past is trapped in it, is immobilized in the prison of his undiscovered self, end quote. So that is especially visible, Wilborn argues. It is especially visible, that articulation, formation of Baldwin's vision. It is especially visible in the progress from early drafts of the novel to the final draft, the changes that he made to the novel. And there are two major changes. First one, the attention that he devoted to secondary characters. So the main character, central character, John Grimes, was initially, he had a larger share of the story. So more Sartrean existentialism, you might say. Focus on the individual. But with revisions, we get more and more share given to the secondary characters, John's stepfather, mother, and aunt. Not only to understand them, but as a means of understanding John and John's condition. The second major change was John's moment of insight in the final chapter, that ecstatic moment when he has an insight about who he is described in the final versions as a religious conversion. It is described with a religious language. Even though Baldwin himself at that point was separate and he had parted ways with his religious upbringing, religious tradition. But John's insight, John's vision is described with religious language, and that is an indication that he's describing John's coming to terms with his life, coming to terms with his freedom as a way of connecting to his contingent situation, not leaving the conditions of his life, but realizing them, understanding them, embodying them. That realization is a combination of two things, as Wilborn points out. One is hindsight, the other one is, he describes it as insight. Hindsight is historical understanding of self and others, family, and insight is an inward understanding of self. So the understanding of self is not isolated from understanding the rest of the family. It is about understanding the fate of the family and how my story is one aspect of that fate, that larger fate. Okay, that's it for now. Thank you for staying with me until this point. Please check out the schedule of my reading group, Patreon page. Please like and subscribe if you like the video. And I look forward to speaking with you in future videos. Thank you.